Well, it's good to be back on stage. It's been such a long time. Once again, I really want to thank the sponsors, Jamie, as ever, and your team for putting together this incredible event, which is the sort of lifeblood of, especially for those of us who are writers, to get to meet an audience that's as intelligent and as engaged as this one is really always a pleasure, year in and year out. So thank you. It's a privilege to be here. And we have the most extraordinary panel, I think, yet on stage here at Rancho Mirage. I'm saying we have just under 44 minutes, so I'm going to keep the introductions very brief. Brian Williams of NBC, broadcaster extraordinaire. Stephen Pinker, professor of so many things at Harvard. I think the word polymath really applies to Stephen. The incredible historian Douglas Brinkley, who I like to joke has only written 400 books, and the worst of it is they're all good. And James Bennet, one of the great columnists of The Economist. And I want to add something personal. A dear friend, an extraordinary boss and mentor for me at the New York Times. I'm honored to share the stage with you. So we're here to talk about the state of our institutions. Maybe we could have titled this session, The State of Our Decline. All of our institutions in this country seem to be, with few exceptions, in real peril. They are struggling. The Gallup organization for the past 50 years has conducted an annual poll called Trust in Institutions. And whether it's labor unions, Congress, the presidency, organized religion, the media, there isn't an institution that hasn't seen a dramatic fall in the trust that it has with the American people. And more recently, they started polling trust in academia, in higher education, which until a few years ago kind of ranked up there with the military as a high trust institution. That trust has collapsed, withered over the past 10 years. And one of the questions that I have, and maybe, Stephen, I'll start with you. There are two ways of thinking about collapse of trust, and maybe both are partially correct. One is that we live in an age of cynicism. We live in an age of cynicism that paradoxically has been brought about by increased transparency in almost every institution that makes us view them with much less awe than we might have in a previous generation. You think of courtrooms and judges differently when they're on TV. You certainly think of Congress differently when you actually have to watch these people. And some institutionalists argue, well, we haven't fallen that badly. It's just that people see us in a different light. There's a second view, which makes the point that there has been a real decay across institutions, and that if we want to repair the health of those institutions and trust in those institutions, then the advice is physician, heal thyself. And you have had I think a front row seat to what has happened at your own university and at maybe academia more broadly, if you want to enlarge the view there. But what view do you think strikes you as more on the mark? Is it that people have just become cynics, or that these landmark institutions have become less trustworthy and worthy of our support?
Yeah, there's some of each. Now, I would invert the question in that the polls showing decline of trust in institutions all begin after the 1960s. Now, there's some historians here, so I'm a little hesitant in reciting this factoid. That my understanding is that the early 60s were a kind of peak for trust in institutions. Mm-hmm. That actually the default is people don't trust institutions. And so perhaps the better question is not so much why is there a sudden mistrust, but what were the institutions doing kind of right up to the 60s that actually earned them a quite unnatural trust. The natural human tendency is not to put faith in these modern abstractions of institutions with their rules and fiduciary duties. The thing we fall back on is patronage and nepotism and putting your trust in a charismatic leader. The idea that power and privilege and perquisites go according to a set of institutionalized rules. It's very unnatural. And so I think we're just regressing to the natural state in probably most of American history of not particularly trusting institutions. And we should think, what is it that led institutions to earn trust in this unusual period that it would be nice if we kind of got back to? And I think certainly earning the trust, admitting of fallibility in the case, say, of public health institutions and universities, exposing the workings of how if someone is wrong, there's a way of showing that they're wrong, something that universities have not been particularly good at, of kind of showing your work, leading to why, justifying why it's good to have institutions, why the rule of law really is better than the code of vendetta, why peer review and empirical testing is really better than authorities pronouncing dogmas, to constantly take up the burden of justifying why institutions are a good thing, while admitting their fallibility, because we start out ignorant of everything. It's amazing that we know anything about anything, and that ought to be kind of the background assumption, and then from that, institutions justify why they're better than the alternative.
So let's narrow the focus to a university that's near Boston.
Picked at random.
There are many. So how did trust in that particular institution fall so dramatically so quickly? What happened in the last, let's say, 20 years in academia that transformed the image? I mean, there was always a certain level of distrust of Harvard. You know, William F. Buckley's rather talked to the first 100 voters or whatever, 1,000 voters.
I'd rather be governed by the first 200 names in the Cambridge phone book than by the Harvard faculty.
Right, but that was once a kind of an elite complaint about Harvard. What happened in the last 20 years that led to this decline?
So it's a combination. What I get from the polls on why don't you trust universities, part of it is the staggering increases in tuition. Although people are less aware of the staggering increases in financial aid, so not that many people pay the sticker price. But a lot of it is the viral incidents of repression of free speech, often common sense, such as my former student, Carol Hooven, who was in effect driven out of Harvard for saying that there are two sexes, such as the incident that went viral on YouTube a few years ago at Yale of Nicholas Christakis being patiently listening to an obscene tirade because his wife wrote an article that students should be able to choose their own Halloween costumes. So the incidence of just defiance of common sense to impose what used to be called politically correct, now called a woke dogma, has kind of sapped credibility and led people to think that crazy ideas are absolutely entrenched in universities.
James, yesterday, or it was maybe the day before, you had a wonderful panel with Jeff Cowan on whether the mainstream media had become illiberal. And I was watching the panel from the audience, and one of the things that ran through my mind was that perhaps the word illiberal wasn't quite right, but that the more apt word was insular. That mainstream media, elite media, saw the world through reference points that were very narrow. They listened most of all to echoes of themselves. They decreed that only certain members of an expert class had views that were valid. And as a result, they cut themselves off. And in fact, in your famous essay in The Economist about your experience at the Times, you had some line about talking to an America that doesn't quite exist. To what extent do you think that insularity has led to a place where only 18% of Americans have high trust in newspapers?
I mean, I think it's inextricably linked to that. I think we in the media talk a lot about how Americans have lost trust in us. I think we don't think enough about how we betrayed the trust of our own audience and our own readers by being insular, as you described. And that, by the way, is a fundamentally anti-journalistic posture. Like the whole idea of journalism is that you're supposed to be outward-looking, you're supposed to be curious, you're supposed to be humble, interested in a reality that always turns out to be more complex than you imagine. And instead, as we retreated to our newsrooms, as we drew increasingly from the ranks of Ivy League schools, I went to one myself, we, I think, became habituated to projecting our own worldview onto reality. But I'd like to return to the first part of your first question, because I think it really is challenging to journalism that when we were doing our jobs properly, we probably did contribute to institutional decline by through increased transparency, which is fundamental to the goals of journalism, is to increase transparency. A lot of this, I think, did start in the 70s. People dated to Watergate, but actually there were a whole host of revelations that came out after Watergate, and I should defer to the historians in the panel on this, but not just about Richard Nixon's behavior, but about sainted figures like Bobby Kennedy and John F. Kennedy. We learned that Bobby Kennedy was responsible for wiretapping Martin Luther King. This is also the era in which 60 Minutes comes into being. We get a whole new ethos in journalism that is more adversarial and far more skeptical. I think so. There, in doing our jobs properly, I think we also contributed to this cynicism about institutions. I think a little bit, I don't know how to solve this problem because, but I think it goes back a little bit to what Stephen said about the assumption of fallibility. There has to be, ideally, this creates a virtuous cycle. Transparency encourages institutions to take a hard look at themselves and improve, and do better. And that requires a certain amount of good faith in the population at large that they're capable of that. And I think we somehow lost that basic trust.
So this raises a question that I have in my own mind, which is that on the one hand, you want institutions and institutional leaders who are humble. That often increases trust. I think that's Stephen's point, that you are ready to admit mistakes. On the other hand, if you look at the high watermark of trust in institutions, the early 1960s, that was an era where Walter Cronkite would say, well, and that's just the way it is this day of August 24th, 1963, or whatever the date was. And I want to turn to you, Brian, because this is a question that I wrestle with. You're one of the great broadcast anchors of this generation. Do you think that the Cronkite model of the avuncular, knowing, wise, perfectly trustworthy news anchor who told you what things were, and you could say, okay, that's what we're doing. Was that a healthy model? Was it a sustainable model? Is it something that you wish you could go back to, or did that train leave the station a long time ago?
Well, however much we grew up in households that relied on it, and as I said the other night at the John Meacham dinner, in our household, dinner could not start until those words were spoken.
Was it a CBS household?
It was, by Uncle Walter. Quite literally, our meal could not begin until we heard those words. And I think it was the conventional wisdom looking back at it after all these years. It was, the knock on it now is, with our great advanced wisdom, is that it was a very narrow view of the news of the day, that it left out millions of Americans, that this was the view of exclusively older white males, and welcome to the AARP dating game, by the way. This was the view of older white males, without fail wearing white shirts and narrow ties, who all, after the broadcast, got on some branch of the Metro-North Railway to go to a leafy northern suburb to enjoy their leafy families and get back at it the next day after consuming 6 newspapers, all written and edited by the population I just mentioned. So the modern view is we're better at it because our newsrooms are more diverse to match our more diverse country. I would just say James touched on a moment that changed everything, and that was commensurate around the years of the rise of 60 Minutes. Something happened. And what happened is news started turning a profit. And do you know how hard it is to ignore that if you're running a news organization? Suddenly, you're making a couple of shekels every day, and suddenly you're growing in stature and you can afford more equipment and hire more people. Ergo, the era we're living in now, you wake up in the morning and choose the network that tends to agree with you.
Douglas, you know, one of the things that you learn as a historian, I think, is whenever you think something is new, unprecedented, we've never been here before, it's the job of the historian to say, actually, we've been here before many times. I mean, 50 years ago, Gerald Ford, someone you've written about, had just pardoned Richard Nixon. It was a high water mark of distrust in American life. But you can go back to previous eras in American history and see trust in institutions, including governing institutions, collapse and then reconstitute themselves. So looking at this low trust in institutions today, what are sort of the historical landmarks you look to that you think are relevant? And are there any that kind of give us some advice about how we begin to restore trust in institutions?
I think the big problem is the American people have lost trust in the federal government. And how did that happen? We're talking about the Walter Cronkite effect. When Cronkite signed off his last interview with Ronald Reagan in the White House, goodbye, things had been, America had gone topsy-turvy by then. The defining moment wasn't Watergate. It was when CBS News' Morley Safer from Canada went with a CBS Saigon bureau. And that's big. News used to have bureaus. CBS had bureaus everywhere. But the Saigon Bureau, Morley showed our Marines with Zippo lighters burning and terrorizing villages. That footage of Morley Safer then went to Tokyo, then to San Francisco, made it to New York, where Dr. Frank Stanton sat in a little photo booth with Walter Cronkite with their big decision. Do we run that on the nightly news? What is it they're running? That our Marines are the bad guys, that we are the terror force in Vietnam, and they put it on. And that evening at about 2 a.m., Dr. Frank Stanton, who was a close friend of Lyndon and Lady Bird, the phone rings and Stanton answers it and he goes, "Frank, what the hell happened today?" And Stanton, in his sleep, didn't know what he was saying. He said, "What do you mean?" He said, "That communist reporter of yours on our troops." And Stanton said, "No, Mr. President, we checked him out very thoroughly. He's Canadian." And
well, just as well.
And when he said that, Johnson said,
we have a Canadian on stage.
Yeah.
These are tender times right now.
Yeah. Johnson said, "I knew there was something wrong with that boy." Because no God-loving American would show our Marines shitting on the flag in front of millions of people. And he was ticked. Now, at first, you could make it funny, Lyndon, using barnyard language, but put yourself in Lyndon Johnson's place in '65. We were all in it together in World War II, the media. All it was propaganda. And the Korean War, And now suddenly in the nightly news is showing our Marines as the bad guys. And at the same time, when the nightly news went from a mere 15 minutes to 30, it was revolutionary. And that started right before Kennedy's death. And then 30-minute news that you're watching started giving back of the book stuff. So you do the 15-minute opening news, headline, ticker tape, AP news. Then CBS and other networks would follow a thread of a story. CBS happened to pick Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. wherever he would go, and space, wherever they would go. And in that turmoil after Kennedy and Cronkite took the glasses off and looked, it's the distrust begins with the Warren Commission report. Nobody sees how Oswald was I'm not saying I don't, I'm just saying the public got suspicious. Did the FBI have a role in King's murder and Bobby Kennedy's? What are we doing in Vietnam? Pentagon papers come out, and it looks like the government's been lying about victory in Vietnam. And you started getting a distrust growing. And it got added to that your tax money's being wasted. A Pentagon will spend $10,000 for a hammer. And so by the time Reagan comes in and Cronkite's gone, yes, it's cable news coming in and then social media and the like, but it becomes conspiracy theories. I mean, you want to look at young people who don't think Neil Armstrong walked on the moon? Look it up, guys. I'm not talking about 1 or 2%. You're talking about 30% of young Americans think something it's fake. It was done in Hollywood. In this blend that we have now of no fact-based reporting, for whatever Cronkite was, he had one rule. It's my face hanging out. That sounds like Nixon, but he said, meaning, I want 3 sources. I don't need to break the news first. I want longevity for my career. He grew up very poor in the Depression. Nickel and dime. His mother raised him alone in an apartment in Houston. And he's like, so he didn't worry to be the first to say something. He was happy to get the AP or UPI and then come in. And he did build a trust in journalism. When he left, with that last interview with Reagan, not just Walter himself, but journalism had a 75% approval rating. And you said it's at 18% now. And
18% for newspapers, 11% for TV.
And 11% for TV.
Hey, I'm not in the game anymore. One of us is still working.
But that's a big drop in trust in the fourth estate going on, and they don't. And then that issue is big. But I think more the thing to do is you rightfully, I feel, said the early '60s. Think what you want. World War II, not only we were all in together, look at the industrial mobilization, miracle factories. The World War II, the greatest generation of broke-all calls, all we did. And then we had Truman, who desegregated the armed forces, and Truman creating CIA and Joint Chiefs of Staff and the Pentagon and National Security Advisor, and Eisenhower, a fiscal conservative.
Douglas, let me break in for 1 second.
Yeah.
So even in the 1950s, you had what Arthur Schlesinger called the paranoid style in American politics. It is a constant in American life. It's a constant in all political life. There have always been conspiracy theorists. There's a profound strain of irrationalism that courses through every society because it courses through every person. But Stephen, you've written a lot about enlightenment and you wrote a book, Enlightenment Now, 6 or 7 years ago. And in many respects, you've been kind of a rational optimist in some of your thinking. Question I have is, at least to me, it seems like the foundations of the open mind, the liberal in the broadest sense mind, that those foundations have been eroding in almost every respect. One of the differences between our politics today and, say, our politics in 1963 is that in 1963, the people in the high places could talk to a critical mass of Americans who had been brought up in a kind of liberal intellectual tradition, and rationalism could prevail over irrationalism. I think many of us look at politics today and see that the opposite is happening. Irrationalism consistently has the winning hand over rationalists. A, is that your perception? And B, give us a sense of how that gets turned around.
Yes, so I grapple with the puzzle of how a species like ours, speaking as a cognitive psychologist, we're so saddled with fallacies and biases, and Daniel Kahneman won a Nobel Prize documenting them. Nonetheless, we have been able, as a species, to do accomplish remarkable feats of rationality. We got to the moon, we invented vaccines.
We claim to have gone to the moon.
Yeah. We claim to have gone to the moon. And I think we've done it through institutions. That is, sets of norms and rules that try to bring out our better angels, to use a phrase, to make us more rational, more civilized, more peaceful as a collective than any of us is individually. The default is, the background is, people don't believe that that you can get to an objective, rationally established truth outside their own everyday lives. I mean, people are perfectly rational for how you get gas in the car and food in the fridge. But when it comes to things outside what you can actually see and experience yourself, historical events, causes of fortune and misfortune, the natural human tendency is no one knows, and so whatever is the most empowering myth is good enough for me. We have to remind ourselves how unnatural it is to have institutions like journalism and science that do these weird things like insist on 3 sources before you say something is true, or go out and do an experiment and then let your peers criticize it, rather than authority and doctrine and charisma, which are the natural human ways of assessing the truth outside your own immediate experience. So I like to kind of invert the question and not say what has gone wrong, but what sometimes goes right, and how can we get more of that. And again, taking a chance at making some historical claims in the presence of a real historian. I think conspiracy theories, misinformation, superstition are pretty much the norm. In particular, including it in levels of government, anti-Catholic conspiracy theories, anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, the Freemasons, other times the communists. I think quantitative assessments of conspiracy thinking, as measured by, say, samples of letters to the editor over a century, show they're pretty much flat. That's just the natural tendency is an interesting story, an interesting myth, especially one that makes your coalition look good and the other one look bad. It's just the natural way we think. And the idea that we should source things and fact check them and empirically test them before you believe them, that's really unnatural. I mean, it's a really good thing, but the case constantly has to be made that it's a good thing.
Where we had that was, Time Magazine's Person of the Year in 1960 was scientist. Everybody thought the scientists were out of the politics, that you can judge what they said. And Eisenhower created NASA after Sputnik in the name of peace and science exploration. And then when Kennedy started doing his moonshot, it was very clever because he was painting it as anti-communist. We're not going to war, but we'll have a friendly football game to the moon. Well, no Republican. Kennedy was getting everything rubber stamped, and all the senators had to go along with the funding of it because all you had to do if you were a Democrat to a Republican, you don't want to beat Russia to the moon. When Kennedy debated Nixon, his one killer line was to Nixon, if you're president, I see a Soviet flag on the moon. If I'm president, it's going to be an American flag. And that became a bipartisan movement. And that period that we're talking about, 60s, 70s, there still was that bipartisan spirit. And people went to the Senate to get legislation passed so they can have a dam named after them or a bridge named after them or be remembered in history. We are now back when Obama was president, the Republicans didn't want to be in a photo with Barack Obama. No Democrat wants to have his arm sitting with Trump. Look how Scarborough has got pummeled for going to Mar-a-Lago. It's like it's like this. But we can remember there was a time when science had an integrity. Public science. We brought it into public discovery.
Can I mention just one other historical episode that's consistent with that? Is that when the efficacy of Jonas Salk's polio vaccine was announced, it was a day of national celebration. Church bells rang and factory whistles blew and strangers hugged each other in the street. That was, I think, 54, where the scourge of polio was finally going to be vanquished. And so that also contributed to the prestige of science spilling over to 1960.
Well, this actually raises something that I want to get James and Brian to comment on. There's science and then there's technology. And one of the ways in which institutions lose trust takes place during eras of technological change. Gutenberg's Bible did more to destroy trust in the Catholic Church than any corruption in the church itself. Hitler's great tool was the radio. And now we have the advent of social media. And I think it's impossible to talk about trust in institutions without factoring in the way social media affects how institutions are able to conduct their business. And so either of you, like your thoughts on what social media has meant for these bedrock institutions, NBC News, the New York Times, how has that shifted the way in which you do your job?
Well, you should actually comment on this too, Bret, but we've seen, I mean, how many hundreds of years of war followed the Gutenberg Bible, by the way?
That's right.
Unfortunately, it is a pretty troubling precedent, and I think social media has contributed hugely, I think, to all the trouble we've seen in the news business, not only how it's affected the business model, but how it's kind of inverted power relationships. I don't want to pretend by any means that things were perfect in the old days. I start sounding like an old crank when I talk about any of this stuff, but the reality is that editors are scared of the reaction of a limited number of their readers, the loudest voices on Twitter, and editors are scared of their interns and their ability to kind of go public with complaints about how a given piece might have made them feel unsafe or exhibited some form of bias. And that makes it very hard for serious-minded editors to do what institutions have always done, or aspired, in my view, to do, which is to pass on values and principles to the next generation. I think when you're quaking in your boots, and you're afraid to tell somebody that they're wrong and they should think about the world a different way, it's very hard to have those kinds of conversations.
I insist we're still a trusting people. We're getting to that tipping point. But I also insist that based on the lowest entry-level investment possible, Russia realized that with a little social media tinkering in the UK, Brexit was possible. Goal number one was the destruction of the Atlantic Alliance. We've seen what has happened since. Social media is it's a cesspool today. And the lead story on X as we walked into this room says that nothing could be a better capsule of our times. Today's executive order banning paper straws. I wish I was kidding.
I'm not against it, but go ahead.
One of the interesting things about social media is that how no one really anticipated what it would lead to. It seems like ancient history, but in the 80s and 90s, one of the narratives was that we are being deprived of information because it's controlled by an oligopoly of a small number of wealthy media companies. Noam Chomsky, my colleague at MIT at the time, wrote a book called Manufacturing Consent, that a small number of corporations controlled the flow of information. And what a utopia it would be if everyone could just express their opinions and spread it to the world. What I think few of us realized at the time was, and this is a theme that James brought up, is that truth is very fragile and precious, and unless that just letting everyone say what they want is not going to get us to the truth. It's going to get us to more and more florid conspiracy theories, the norm in human history, but that rare, precious things like you got to set up an institution that is committed to fact-checking and free speech and empirical testing and vetting and editing, that unless you have that very artificial infrastructure of truth-seeking, the default is we're going to fall back on myths and superstitions and conspiracy theories.
James, you mentioned values and principles in institutions. And my experience of well-run institutions is that values and principles happen because there's leadership. It is the difference between successful institutions and unsuccessful ones. And even if you look in academia today, it's not that every university is in trouble. It's the institutions, it's the universities that have been ill-led that are in trouble. My friend Dan Diermeyer at Vanderbilt is doing a perfectly great job, just as my old friend Bob Zimmer did at the University of Chicago. And I guess I want to talk about this theme of leadership in the last few minutes. Maybe Douglas, press on you. One guy who no one expected would, I think, be as large a historical figure as he is Jerry Ford. And Jerry Ford in 1974 gave Richard Nixon a full and unconditional pardon. He probably sealed his political fate by that decision, but it allowed him to govern, and it's now, I think, looked back on as a touchstone of political courage. Other historical examples that come to mind of values and principles rescuing, in this case, the White House, an institution, from corrosive distrust?
Yes, I mean, I think you have to deal with the term of narcissism and a covert narcissist as president. After all, these are people that want to be the top. They think they're the smartest person, and some are really have issues. But Truman wasn't addicted to power like that, and so he did a lot of things. He could have run in '52, but he went home with Bess, even though his poll numbers were low, and said, I've done what I could done, which was considerable. Eisenhower has a great sanity to him with his 2 terms. I find Barack Obama, the ego Obama's there, but he had a sanity of leadership where you're not getting anything big, illegal, crazy done. It's kind of sane leadership. So you have to watch out for demagogues. And you're right. I mean, they're all over the place. Like you mentioned, Father Coughlin, but Joe McCarthy and the Birchers or Lyndon LaRouche. But they tend to be fringe. They do get movements going, but they then get big-footed. I mean, McCarthy is such a big person of the 50s. How did he end? Pouring down whiskey bottles and collapsing and dying under the pressure because the army got Joe McCarthy. I don't know what Trump's doing with our military right now. The U.S. military probably is, the armed forces, the highest institutional approval, but it's getting into the mall now, you know, I think of being ripped. I think we make a mistake of doing presidential history as this president's and the President's Club, and here are the founding documents, Constitution, Bill of Rights, and then it moves Gettysburg Address and all this. I think we need to read the Transcendentalist, got to read Walt Whitman and Emerson and Thoreau, and when they write about the democracies, it starts with the individual, and that you have to build yourself for it. And they're a needed component now, and what's happening is at these universities, you're naming the big-name players who are presidents of them, and will Trump go after them? How do they deal with Israel, Gaza, and all this? Humanities are being gutted everywhere. That humanities money's drying up. And it used to be in the 60s and 70s, for better or worse, but the faculty had power. Faculty does not have power. Money's coming to the university. It's $1 billion fundraising affair. And the board of trustees are the ones, and they are looking to find professors they don't like that seem to be anti-corporate or have a beef with something seeming radical. And there's a kind of purge going on right now. this was articulated in Lewis Powell's famous memo. He had been the chief tobacco lobbyist. He had been the head, working with all the chambers of commerce in the Powell memo before he became Supreme Court Justice, in which he said the left, meaning Rooseveltism, but by name he was angry at Ralph Nader and the consumer movement, Rachel Carson, environment. But he said the left, liberals, have taken over the mainstream media, Justice Powell said. They've taken over the universities, lecture series, newspaper editors, we have nothing as corporate conservative capitalist left. We need to start a 40-year plan.
But wait, hang on a
out
second.
of that, well, I know, but out of that plan did grow the Hoover Institution. It did grow to the Cato Institute. It did go to American Enterprise Institute. It did go to the Chafees and the Koch brothers. I mean, all I'm suggesting is the 60s were dramatic, and by the time Nixon did endangered species, clean air, and clean water, those extraction world people, big gas and oil, the energy thing, that's Trump's main thing, they've had it because they thought this movement took over and it'll be socialist America, not capitalist America. We don't recontrol the narrative. And they got Fox News and the rest. So now it's the same battle between the 60s, people won in the 60s.
Let me break in here. One, because you raised something that I think is a valid objection. I mean, I'm sorry, but the mainstream landmark institutions are ideological monocultures. The reason there's a Hoover and a Cato is that conservative-leaning scholars could not find homes in those places. And so I want to ask, maybe James actually, since you know something about this, what do you think the value is of what now goes by the word viewpoint diversity in restoring trust in an institution like, let's say, a major metropolitan newspaper somewhere to the east of here?
Look, I mean, I think it is invaluable. And can I just give one, back to your question about leadership, though? So when I joined The Economist, it was still COVID times. I had never worked there before. So the first thing I wanted to learn as much as I could about the place, I went to the orientation for the new class of interns, right? I joined the interns and getting and a senior editor in London was giving us an introduction to The Economist, and she put up a slide, and the slide was, this is who we are. And the first bullet point was, we believe in capitalism. And there were 4 more bullet points, and I almost wept. And it's not because I believe so deeply in capitalism, although I do. It's because there was clarity about what the institution was and what it stood for. And there was an implicit message. If you don't believe in this stuff, that's totally reasonable, but this is probably not the place for you. And we have the conversation about these principles, but understand what our expectations are. And honestly, I feel like those were the conversations we weren't having at the New York Times, because there used to be a way that you absorbed the culture of the place through the training you got. That approach was wiped out with the internet era and the loss of a lot of experienced journalists. And all I mean is institutions, the military did rebuild after the Vietnam period. It did get trust back because of clarity about what its values were. And so I think it is possible, even in an age of social media.
And Reagan.
But it takes leadership.
So just in the minute we have left, a little bit of a prediction. 4 questions to each of you. Brian, will TV news or digital news find a way to restore trust? Stephen, will academia find a way? Will democratic institutions find a way? And will the New York Times find a way?
Well, look at the time. I'll go first. I think it's going to be tough. Right now, the #1 job, if you run a cable news channel, a broadcast news network, is talking down your own product. And because Wall Street expects you to say it, talk up streaming. It's all streaming. Never mind the fact that television and cable work perfectly well. They're a great delivery system, tried and true. Look at the flat screen in all of your homes. Works perfectly. So I think it's now getting twisted in technology, and I think some days the content is an afterthought. That is hardly a way to improve.
Stephen?
I think it will get better, if for no other reason than that it's a thing that people recognize, that universities have gotten so crazy that the country has taken notice. Many sectors within academia who just were thinking am I crazy or is everyone crazy? And then they're starting to realize that it's not just them. There's a lot of institutional inertia. There's a generational gradient that's going to make it harder, the younger, the woker. But the fact that it's gotten so extreme means that the inevitable pushback has begun.
Douglas?
We got to really think about before college, because as we know, most Americans don't go to college, and we're not doing a good job in our public schools. We're not teaching geography, we're not teaching civics, we're not teaching American history, we're not teaching public service, there is no draft, there's a disengagement writ large, and we've got to address it there. I'm less worried about the colleges. It'll fix itself because the new left did get tenure. So it's hard to get rid of tenured professors, but they are going to stop tenure a lot of places, and it'll be a freer marketplace of ideas, because really it's like sports. If you just, who produces will make them get picked and get paid and get that. But in the meantime, while that's working itself out, I think we've got to hone in, and I'll tie it together with Walter Cronkite told me the biggest problem is our iPhones that we're giving them to kids at 12, 13, 14 years old, and it's a wild west of hate, pornography, misogyny, pick your poison, and no instruction manual. And parents are busy, and so they're naturally going to deviant things or listening to deviant voices. So he said, when I was young at Lamar School in Houston, we would do typing. You were forced to take typing. Now you should be forced, public schools, to just learn how to use the tool that is the gift of the internet, but just don't to give them at that age this free thing. It's warping young minds. It's making them addicted to looking down, and it becomes a problem when we can fix it because the technology is spectacular.
And James, the last word to you.
Regarding the Times, I guess I feel like we're going to have to see braver decisions than we've seen taken so far, but you're still writing for the New York Times, so I certainly haven't given up hope.
Thank you very much.